Good morning.
Good morning. Good to see everyone.
It's great to have everyone here. And as I mentioned, and for those of you who just joined, this is a 4-session class on storytelling. This is the 4th session of it. So we're going to wrap things up today and get you set up for next week. I think Josh is doing a special Pesach lesson. And then we're into Passover, and you'll have your seders, and you'll be wonderful storytellers and storyteller listeners, and it'll be great. And you'll give me feedback on how that all went. So let's start with the blessing. I'm going to ask everybody if they would to put themselves on mute. Thank you all. There we go. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. All right. So first thing I want to do is just offer a review of the first 3 sessions as a lead-in to today's session together. And if you were here for part of them, but not all of them, I'm going to give a rather detailed review so you'll be on board. The point of this course is to give us some tools and sort of an insight into various ways of telling stories from different perspectives. So the first lesson 4 weeks ago, was basically a way of telling stories using your imagination and personalizing the story. So we had the story, a small piece of text from the Exodus about the slavery being oppressive. And the passage that was clipped to accompany that, to embed that, was from a rabbi who suffered in the Holocaust and died in the Holocaust. And his works were kept, he hid his works in a milk can, that canister was found and opened, and his works were found. And when he uses that passage, what he does with it is he tells a story about slavery in Egypt. But you can see, once you know his biography, you can see that he is using his personal experience and his imagination to enrich the story and engage the reader. So that was the point of the first session. Just to go ahead, it's a permission to go ahead and elaborate based upon experiences that you have had. And it is partly coming from the injunction to tell the story as if you were there, as if you personally experienced what happened. The second session, the angle shifts. So whereas we have often, I would say on the majority of time, we tell the story from the perspective of the Hebrews. We tell the story from the perspective of our history and our legacy. But this time, the question was, whose story is it? And from what perspective is the story being told? If we shift the perspective from which the story is being told, how does that further enable us to get into the story, to dive in? And what Dina did with that passage, with the second session, was to start the story, not in Exodus, not in the book of Shemot, but to rewind just a little bit and go back to the end of Genesis and see from the end of Genesis that during the 7 years of famine in Egypt, the Egyptians were suffering. And what Joseph organized on behalf of Pharaoh was for the Egyptians to buy grain, and when their money ran out, to give all of their flocks and herds for grain, and when they had no more flocks and herds, to give their land and their freedom, their bodies, in exchange for food. So that by the end of those 7 years of famine, the Egyptian population did not own its own money, did not own its own cattle, did not own its own land, and did not own its own freedom. And then we enter, there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. That shift in perspective, taking on the story from the beginning of where the Egyptians might tell the story, really gives us a different understanding of it, right? I remember we had a really interesting conversation about that. The third session last week, we took a dive into how we tell the story differently depending upon who is listening to the story. So, and we focused primarily on the 4 children, but the wicked child. What does it mean to have someone listening to your story who is pushing against you and against that experience and against that story, does not want to become engaged with it personally, does not want to take it on as part of their identity? 2 approaches are offered last week. One is to be forthright and didactic. Well, if you were there, you would not, this is what happened to me, meaning to me and not to you. If you had been there, you would not have been saved. So it's rebuke in a rather direct and forceful way. The second example was the rabbi who is so honorable and so self-effacing that he cannot directly rebuke someone, but rather sees within himself or herself, but sees within themselves flaws that need attention, flaws that need correction. And when the story is told, this rabbi tells the story in such a way that the listener sees that the rabbi himself struggles to respond to the flaws that he notices in himself. And therefore, by example, even the wicked child would begin to say, well, if he is struggling, then it's okay that I am struggling. And there may be an opening for the wicked child to enter the story. That's what we've had so far. What we are going to do today is play around with how the story for Passover is actually told during the night of Seder. So how do we tell the story? And what Dina is pointing out in the video is that we don't have a script for the story. If you want a script for the story, then you need to go to Exodus and you should read the book of Exodus. But not very much of the book of Exodus is given in the Haggadah, and the way in which it is given is not in a storytelling form. Different verses are excerpted, and then they're discussed or analyzed, and the rabbis say this or this. We have many, many rituals. We have a Seder plate. We have the items on the Seder plate. We have 4 cups of wine, and we have that 5th cup. We have taking the wine out of our cups with our finger or the edge of a spoon or something when the plagues are mentioned. We have all of these rituals, washing our hands, all of this. But the one thing Dina says we really don't have, the night of Seder, is a script for telling the story. Well, this becomes a do-it-yourself opportunity because we're enjoined to tell the story, but we're not given the story to tell. So how do we do that? So we're going to draw upon the 3 prior lessons. We're going to do that personally, imaginatively, with enriched details that come from experiences that we've had. We're going to do that by noticing the perspective of the people who are telling the story, and that there can be multiple perspectives for that. We're going to do it by noticing and really being sensitive to the people who are hearing the story and trying to shape it so that it becomes a story that they can embrace. I'm going to pause there for a second for questions or comments, what that makes you think of, anything you would like to share. No? Then let's dive in. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with you. Don't want that. I do want that. All right. So I know that you know that I can't see many of you. So I'm going to ask someone to just sort of nod that they can say, that you can see the text. All right, excellent. Let's skip down to number 1, the Seder in the Mishnah. And then we'll get to our first resource. The Seder, as we know it, is modeled after the guidelines presented by the Mishnah in the 10th chapter of Pesachim, though the Haggadah that we use now has gone through much modification and expansion throughout the years. In this text, we're going to look for the kernel of the obligation to tell the story of the Exodus on Passover, the kernel of it. As you're reading the text, try to figure out how the different sections relate to each other. Often in the Mishnah, there will be disagreement without any language that says explicitly, I disagree. When different opinions are offered, it is up to us, as the learners of this text, to figure out how these opinions relate to each other. Is opinion 2 restating opinion 1, expanding upon opinion 1, uninterested in opinion 1, rejecting opinion 1? Here we go. This is from the 10th chapter of Pesachim in the Mishnah. The second cup is poured, and here the son asks his father, and if the son is not cognitively capable, his father trains him to ask, Ma nishtana halayla hazeh? How is this night different from all other nights? So here comes the first response, and this is a version of telling the story. For on all other nights we eat either leavened bread or matzah, but on this night we only eat matzah. For on all other nights we eat other vegetables, but on this night we eat only maror. For on all other nights we eat meat roasted, stewed, or cooked, but on this night we eat only roasted. For on all other nights we only dip once, but tonight we dip twice. And according to the cognitive abilities of the son, the father teaches him. Footnote. You'll notice there's a diamond at the end of, for all other nights we eat meat roasted, stewed, or cooked, but on this night we eat only roasted. That question no longer exists in the Haggadah. Since the destruction of the second temple, we don't have a ritually acceptable way to roast that offering. There is no actual offering. So in place of that, we have the, on all other nights, we can sit or recline. Why on this night do we recline? A couple of things, and then I'm going to open it up for a question I've got. So first of all, to note that since the time of the Mishnah, when this tractate was written, we have already made a major change in a core section of the Haggadah. We've taken out one of the responses to the question, Ma nishtana, and replaced it with a different response. Here we have an opportunity to say, well, if we are doing that for one of the original pieces of the, original verses of the Mishnah, can we do it for other aspects of the Haggadah? The answer is yes. And because the answer is yes, we have a plethora of Haggadot to choose from. We have an opportunity to create a Haggadah of our own. We have a wonderful chance to save all the Haggadot that our children made over all the years when they were in religious school, and totally adorable, aren't they? So this is already a do-it-yourself project. It's built into the kernel of the question and the first response. And what I'd like to do before we go on is ask this. Is the response to the question, Ma nishtana halayla hazeh, is it a satisfying response? Yes, no, maybe, partly. We'll see. And is it a telling of the story? This is provided as a way to fulfill the injunction to tell the story. Does this tell the story? That's where I want to stop sharing for a minute and see what you think.
Diane.
Yeah, Archie. Oh, and then, I'm sorry, Archie, then Joel? Yes, okay. Good.
So the responses, the original responses related to what you consume during the meal. The first response related to me to how you enjoy the meal, meaning
Okay.
the lack of formality, you recline.
Okay.
On all other nights, you would sit and finish your meal. But on this night, after you've had your maror and your matzah and said the brachas, maybe the second glass of wine, you could do what you don't do on all other nights and recline. That's the enjoyment of the meal.
Free people recline. Free people have the option of reclining.
Right.
Right? So we sort of evoke that sense of we are free to sit how we choose, and we are free to recline if we choose. And in fact, we do recline. Yeah, good. Joel, and then I think Phyllis, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so first a cute comment. I don't understand why we took out the part about roasting, because I mean, doesn't everybody have brisket at the Seder? So that's just a joke.
You're cute.
The answer to your question is no. It's not a story. It's answering the questions, but they are sort of mechanical aspects of what we're supposed to do and respond to. It's not a story. So we've taken up your idea of finding other ways to actually tell a story of the departure of. We do mention Moses during the Seder because that's part of the story.
I'm going to build upon the idea that you just raised about it being mechanical. This is one of the drawbacks of having the script given to us. And I would even posit that while we're pointing out 4 things that distinguish the night of Seder from most other nights, that may or may not be what anybody at the Seder table is really curious about. I don't know if that's what they want to know. I'm telling the answers to things that I don't know if those are their questions. And the truth is, if we had an opportunity to say to someone, especially middle school kids, high school kids, what are your real questions right now? What are you really thinking about these days that you would like to know, that you would like to understand? I have a feeling it's not about the matzah and the maror. Why we dip twice. Right, which seems the least of the questions to be curious about. Phyllis, what was your thought? Wait, you're on mute. There you go.
Joel hit upon what I was going to say. It's just a mechanical response, and it certainly doesn't answer the question, it answers the question, but it doesn't. It's not satisfying. If I were sitting there, okay, so we eat matzah. Why? My question is that this provokes more questions.
That's the hope. That has to be the hope. Because if this is all there is, right, and that fulfills the obligation, I think it's pretty thin soup. I just don't think it is satisfying. Anybody else want to comment here? Okay, so let me take the next. And there was something in the chat, I'm sorry. Okay, so the chicken and the meat, it's not a prohibition against eating meat during Seder. That's not the issue. The issue is the ritual of roasting it and offering the sacrifice. Without the temple, we don't have the wherewithal to offer sacrifices, which threw the Jewish community into an untold crisis, of which this little piece is the least of our worries, right? So if we don't have the temple, there's a lot that we need to adjust to in order to maintain a Jewish faith. And yes, we don't have the wherewithal to roast this sacrifice and to take that roasted meat and offer it. Okay, but we have bigger fish to fry, if I can use another food metaphor. All right, let's take a look at the next section. And this small paragraph here is considered a second response to the telling of a story. All right, so we switch gears. He, meaning the father, begins with the negative and ends with the positive. And he teaches the passage, my father was a wandering Aramaean from Devarim, until he finishes the whole section. My father was a wandering Aramaean, and he went into Egypt, and he came out with, he was brought out with an outstretched hand and all of this. It's a long section. So this part right here, right, is considered an alternative or a supplement or a complement to the initial Manish Chana. Well, we dip twice, and we eat matzah, and we eat maror, okay? So the same question then, is this the telling of the story? Now in the Haggadah, there would be more verses, but the key passage here is not the content of the story. The key passage here is to start with the negative, but end with the positive. That however we do tell the story, we start with oppression, but we end with redemption. How does that fulfill the obligation to tell the story? What does that offer?
I still don't think it offers any logical explanation. I mean, you have the story, and then you have, the questions like, why is this different? So my only concern is, like, why not tell the story on any other night? Why specifically just one night, and not, like, say, on Rosh Hashanah or on any other holiday? Yeah, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fulfill my curiosity in this case.
I'm actually really moved by that, Vera. The question, on this night, we tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. But on all other nights, we just sit down and say the bracha, and we have our meal, and then we clean the dishes. So I think that's a really interesting question. Why on this night do we tell the story? And then my secondary question, why in telling the story are we enjoined to tell the story from the negative to the positive? Why does the arc need to go in that direction? Thoughts on that? And is that helpful to you as you think about how you will tell the story a week from now? Yeah, sure.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I think the negative starts again because we were slaves. And so we have to remember how oppressed we were and how we had no freedoms until we were released from God. So it's like, we have a rough life, and now look at us. We're free. We can celebrate. We can eat. But we have to remember, as we say, we were once slaves in the land of Egypt, because you never forget. So,
and Shar, if you were going to be very, very didactic with a child in front of you, very clear in your teaching, and you tell the story and you have the arc going from the negative to the positive, what would you hope that child, let's say that child is 10, 11, 12, whatever, what would you hope that child would walk away understanding that they might not understand so clearly before? What is the lesson?
That there's hope, that there's a happy ending. And, we live in a sitcom world, so something has to happen and be resolved in 20 or 25 minutes. And if it's not, then we're upset. So you're teaching a child, this happened, but here's the good that happened from this, because we forth an effort to make this happen. It just didn't fall into our laps. We actually had to work for it. So if you're working towards a goal, there's a reward at the end.
Now you're leaving out, I know I don't mean to be putting pressure on you, but I noticed that you are leaving out one huge element of the redemption, which is God's hand in this. Is that a lesson we want our children to walk away with, to say, God redeemed me, God redeemed us? And that's the positive end of this story. Yeah. Mhm.
Absolutely. And that's,
Yeah.
I think as a Jew, you're always cognizant of being Jewish. You're always, I think about it. I'm a Jew every day, and my actions reflect on that. And I think some of it is I work with some people who are, I know they're anti-Semitic, and they'll make comments, and sometimes you have to educate them.
Yes.
And so I just have to shake my head and walk away, because it's not worth of the discussion with them. But it's just, it's we need God in our life. I mean, what the hell's happening in the world today? It's
very helpful.
It's just ingrained in us.
Thank you. And I'm curious, is there another lesson that you would want that 10-year-old to walk away with? Phyllis?
To switch gears,
Okay.
I think the story can be told, or is told, through the 4 cups of wine. I mean, to me, that would be a much better way to go from the negative to the positive, and ending up with liberation. And perhaps on the way to ask the question, what is freedom? I mean, what does freedom mean to you? But I see the 4 glasses of the 4 cups of wine as a means to really tell the story to everybody.
So those 4 cups of wine sort of punctuate the telling of the story and give it momentum so that it moves the story forward. Got it.
Rather
Okay.
than answering the 4 questions, because even what you're saying, and even with the addendum, it doesn't do it. It doesn't really tell the story.
There's one more lesson. Thanks, Phyllis. I agree. There's another lesson with this passage in terms of going from the negative to the positive. So when you start a story that we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, one of the lessons that allows you to bring out is that there are still people who are oppressed in the world. And we know that experience. We share that pain with them. So it's one thing to say, well, I had a rough time, but everything's fine now, and walk away from the, play over, walk away. It's another thing to say, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You were oppressed by Pharaoh. You know what this is. Do not turn your back on those who still need you, you might be in a very nice position right now. Fine. Good. Turn around, lend a hand, and help someone else experience part of what you have experienced, right? The arc allows you to do that, I think. Thoughts on that?
Diane?
Yeah, Joel.
We do have the paragraph, Avadim Hayinu leparo b'Mitzrayim ve'Adonai, and God took us out of there.
Right.
So that actual language is there. So now I'm thinking about it, I'm wondering why that doesn't satisfy, because it doesn't. It still doesn't feel like a story, a moving tale, something that's really gonna, stay with you, sit with you when you're 4, 5, 8, 10, 15 years old, or 50.
What's missing?
It's there, but it's still somehow insufficient.
It's almost as though the belly got dropped out. What's missing?
A tale.
The tale, the actual story. So, like, what happened, right? So if a grandparent tells their granddaughter what happened when he was their age, and a funny story, or an embarrassing story at school, or how he fell in love with grandma, or whatever it is, almost always that child is going to say, can you tell me another one? Right? Can you tell me another story about dad when he was a boy? Can you tell me another story about how mom got locked out of the house and had to crawl through the milk chute and got stuck, which is actually a story in our family. My mom got locked out of the house, and so she tried to crawl through the milk chute and she got stuck. And when grandma came home and saw half of her daughter's butt and legs out in the right towards the driveway and the rest of her enclosed in this. So you tell that story, and for sure kids are going to say, oh my gosh, tell me another one, until you're beginning to run out. But if you just say, your mom was mischievous and a lot of things happened, but she's fine now and she's really calmed down. You're like, okay. It's a nothing burger. All right. Let me show you a third rendition. Here's Rabbi Gamliel. So in terms of fulfilling the obligation to tell the story, Rabbi Gamliel would say, whoever didn't say these three things on Passover does not fulfill their obligation. And these are they: Pesach, the Paschal offering, matzah, and maror. Hit those three. Pesach, because the omnipresent jumped over. Pasach means to jump over. Because the omnipresent jumped over the houses of our forefathers in Egypt. Matzah, because our forefathers were redeemed in Egypt. Maror, because the Egyptians embittered the lives of our forefathers in Egypt. Now Rabbi Gamliel would say, he's not saying, now notice, he's not saying, if you say these things and no more, you have fulfilled the obligation. What he is saying is that if you fail to mention these three things, you have not fulfilled the obligation. So we're going to approach this a little bit differently. The question I'm going to raise is not, does this then tell the story? The question I'm going to raise is, do you agree with Rabbi Gamliel that these three are essential for the telling of the story? Thoughts on that? Yeah, Edith.
Well, those three embody the story, which was just previously mentioned. That's the history that takes us from slavery to freedom.
So you would agree
Yes.
that failing to mention those three is a failure to meet the obligation. Do we all agree on that? That these are just there. This is the ikar. This is the essential element here.
And it's reinforced by the actual tasting, feeling of the story itself through the Seder plate.
Yes, yes. So again, you have, Edith, I'm going to use that to raise a totally different question that pops into my mind right now. Is the tasting, the dipping, the salt water, the visual, the colors of green on the plate, the breaking of the matzah, there's sounds, there's smells, there's taste, there's touch. Is this, in and of itself, storytelling? It may not be sufficient. It may not be necessary.
I think it is.
Shar, go ahead.
So I'm dyslexic. So for me, I'm more visual. I can look at something, but to read something, sometimes I really struggle to understand the concept. But if I can actually see it, so as we look at our Seder plate and we look at everything that's on it, and we're telling this story, to me it sticks more than just reading the story, because it's a story, but you actually see it. So it makes more sense.
So in a way, it enriches it. It complements it.
Absolutely, yeah. And going back to Rabbi Gamliel, it should start with we should say maror first, because we talk about starting with the negative and then and with the positive, right? Which is Pesach. They passed over us.
Okay, we have to enter that into some public journal so that becomes part of the commentary on the commentary. Archie, your hand is up. I'm sorry, I didn't see you before.
No, that's okay. So in the prior explanation, where I justified celebrating the meal by relaxing, I made a mistake, because the roasted meat is supposed to represent the Paschal lamb, which is supposed to represent the marking on the doors to save the firstborn. So
Yes.
why would you use cooked meat to express the part of the story that is very important, that is really blood? There's nothing on the Seder table that represents the blood that was used to mark the doors.
Are you sure?
No.
And I'm going to encourage everyone to take note of the comment that Vera just put into the chat. So Archie, what I would say is this. This is an accumulation. This is an accretion. It is not a mutual either or. We are building with layers. You know, one of the things that my daughter, who's a chef, taught me is that when you make a stew, it's layered, 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 layered. That's what gives it the richness and the depth and the robustness, right? I make a stew. I have the ingredients. I throw them in a pot. I put in some water. I plug in the slow cooker. And I hope at the end that Arthur will eat it. And he always does. So what do I care? Abby, no. And that's the case here. Each of these elements becomes an addition to, a complement to, a supplement
Diane?
of. Yeah.
Diane, I want it to be known to everyone. You make wonderful stew.
How would you know?
Because you brought some to my back door when I was sick one day.
Oh, the chicken soup. Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Oh, good. I'll digress just for a minute, because I actually am not a very good cook, and I'm even worse baker. And Abby is actually a pastry chef. And so one time I was at her, I may have told this before, pardon me. So I was at her bakery, which she doesn't have anymore, but she had opened a bakery, and it was brilliant. Reflected every creative fiber in her being. And I'm looking at this case of pastries that goes from A to Z, and it's amazing. And I said to her, I don't understand. How can you make so many different things? She says, well, Mom, you know, if you have fresh eggs, fresh butter, good flour, you know, anybody, well, not you, but anybody else can make dozens of different kinds of things. And I thought, you're right. Anybody else? Okay. Anyway, pardon the digression. So my point is that all of these strands are to create a weave that is very rich. And at any given moment, we may find ourselves drawing some of them together, others of them together. Rarely will we draw all of them together. But what are the essential elements for us, for you? Gamliel says, going from the negative to the positive is an essential element. Who did we just read? No, that's not Gamliel. That's someone else. I'm not even sure who that was. Gamliel says, make sure you make reference to Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. All right? Someone else might say, well, don't forget the 4 questions, or let's say the 4 answers to the question. Let's take one more. Here's the 4th one. In each and every generation, a person must view himself as though he left Egypt himself. As it says, it's still in Mishnah Pesachim, as it says, And you shall tell your son on that day, saying, because of this, which God did for me when I left Egypt. This is Exodus 13:8. Therefore, we are obligated to acknowledge, praise, glorify, extol, exalt, honor, bless, revere, and laud the one who performed all of these miracles for our ancestors and for us. He took us out of slavery to freedom, from anguish to joy, from mourning to a festival, from darkness to a great light, and from enslavement to redemption. And we will say before him, hallelujah. All right. What does this offer? What does this passage in particular offer? Do you want me to put it back up? Did you have a chance to catch it? Let me just go back to it. Tell your son, this is what God did for me when I left Egypt. We were there. Acknowledge, praise, glorify, etc. And then a listing of the variations of a theme of negative to positive. And for all of this, we say, hallelujah. What does this offer? Yeah, Anita.
To me, this is the essence of the Seder. It's a festival of freedom. And I don't care whether you're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, whatever. This is the story of freedom for everybody. And, this Seder, I'm going to have my first cousin, who was a Catholic deacon, who came to me, that should be interesting, who came to me and said, Anita, I've been to Seders, but they've been Christian Seders. I've never been to a Jewish Seder. Would you invite me? I said, absolutely. And what else I said was, honey, you ain't never been to a Seder till you've been to a Jewish Seder. So this year we're going to have a very interesting experience. But to me, it is the essence of the beautiful gift of freedom, which I'm concerned about lately in this country, but that's another story. It's reinforcing how valuable freedom is to each and every person at the table. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And the people at the table, when I was a kid, we always used to have someone that my aunt would call the anthropologist. So this would be someone who may or may not be Jewish, but was there to observe and to just understand as sort of an outsider. We'd have the anthropologist. How do you tell the story to the anthropologist, right? How do you tell the story to the different people who are at the Seder? Marilyn.
This makes me think of how just the idea of retelling. One year we took Seder to Miami University, and there was Scott's roommate. Nobody was Jewish, but the telling was so much more important that year because we were conveying something so important to us and trying to give our side. And it was probably one of the most special Seders we ever had, but it's all. It wasn't there a book or something called The Telling, and I can't remember. There was a lady. I'd have to. This goes back a few years ago, but it's also that the storytelling, and it's reaching into your core, and that was telling.
This is the power of storytelling, and it is shaped by the audience. And in what you're relating to us, the audience played a very crucial role into the experience. It played a crucial role of the experience of that Seder for everyone. Had it been a different audience, it would have been a different Seder. Absolutely. Yeah, sure. Back to you.
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
Because I came to Judaism as an adult. And we were talking about this earlier with the children. When you were growing up and you were doing your Seders and there were all these stories, did you ever ask where was God when we were slaves? Because, now we're redeemed and we have to remember that it was God, but where was he during all those years of enslavement?
I'll give you a personal example because in the Seders that we had growing up, I actually think that would have been a perfectly appropriate question to ask, but I was always too anxious and nervous to pipe up with much of anything original. But when I was teaching middle school and I had the students, as we worked our way towards Pesach, this was a Tanakh class, I would say to them, I would challenge them and say, I don't think these are your questions. I don't. So what are your real questions? And they would fudge around the borders for a little bit and ask silly things. And I would say, yeah, I don't think that's what keeps you up at night. I don't think that's what really concerns you. And they would get down to some very important questions. And almost invariably, over the 8 or 9 years that I did this, one of the questions would be, why would God let us suffer like that in the first place? If God is able to redeem us, why wait until there's been so much hardship and so much misery? And that question is an everything question. It's an everywhere question. It's an all times question. Point to the time period in history where there hasn't been a group that has been oppressed by another group. Doesn't happen. So why? And it goes to the question of who is this God that everyone seems to be asking me to believe in? So these are very important questions, and I think they're really important. They're absolutely relevant for participation in a Seder. Joel.
What was your answer to those middle schoolers?
Well, what we did was we created what we called a Haggadah supplement. And the kids broke into groups based upon their interests, and each group was responsible for creating anywhere from 2 to 4 pages of the supplement. And the group that did the 4 questions raised their questions, and what they produced were images, poetry, discussion of the issues. I didn't try and answer it for them. I don't have an answer for that. I have the question just as well as they have the question. But then we would print these up in beautiful color and create a Haggadah supplement for each child to take home with them. This is some of the most interesting work I think that I did with the students, because what it really opened the door to them, it opened the door for them to be able to say, there is nothing I can't ask in this class. There is nothing I can't challenge in this class. And that was the underlying lesson of all of it. If Judaism survives this long, do you really think no one has challenged it ever? Do you really think that a 12-year-old's question is going to bring down the religion? I don't think so. So go ahead and ask your questions. I guarantee you Judaism is going to have some kind of response. It's going to be hardy enough to handle the question, and you're not the first. Okay, I'm going to move us on to the second part of the text that Dina has been sharing. So the questions that she has here are the questions that we've been talking about for the most part. This third one, though, I just want to highlight for us. In the Mishnah, there appeared to be a scripted, if not word for word, but a scripted sense of which questions to ask and options for responses. Does it make sense to have a scripted question and answer? What are the benefits of having these guidelines? What are the downsides? And I'm just going to leave that out there for a little bit. Oops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to stop share. I meant to go down. Here we go. Now, our time is a little bit short, so I'm going to go mostly to the questions that she's asking at the end of this. But she's taking a passage from Tosefta, which basically says that the rabbis studied. They were at the Seder and they studied and studied and studied so many hours that dawn was upon them and they had to stop their study. And there's 2 versions of it. One, it happened that Rabbi Gamliel and the elders were having the meal in the house of Beitos ben Zunan in Lod, and they were engaging in the laws of Passover all night until the cocks crow. Someone, raised the plate from in front of them, the rabbis, And they, the rabbis, convened and went to the house of study. So it took someone to come in and say, hello, you've been talking about this for 8 hours. Let's go to the house of study. Different version from a Haggadah. And even if we are all wise and understanding, and all elders and all knowledgeable in the Torah, even if we are that level, it is a mitzvah for us to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And anyone who tells the story of the Exodus from Egypt at length is praised. It happened that rabbis Eliezer, Yehoshua, Elazar ben Azariah, Akiva, and Tarfon were all eating together in Bnei Brak, and were telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt that whole night, until their students came and said to them, our teachers, the time has come to recite the morning Shema. Here are the questions that I think, let's see, which one did I want to focus on? I'm going to go to the third one. The Haggadah not only says that everyone is obligated to tell the story, but it also says that the more one elaborates and the more they tell, the more praiseworthy they are. Why is telling stories considered to be such a good thing in the context of the Seder? Feel free to weave in any insights you had based on earlier texts in this class. We tell the story even if the people at the Seder table are only adults. We tell the story even if the people at the Seder table are all Jewish scholars. We tell the story for the kids, and we tell the story for the parents, and we tell the story for our friends, and we tell the story when we have non-Jewish members at our table, and we tell the story for people who are coming sort of as anthropologists. It doesn't matter. And we tell the story at length, and we are supposed to tell the story at length. That is a praiseworthy process. Why is that? I've heard the story many times. Enough already. No, not enough already. Why not? Yeah, Nancy.
Perhaps it's that the gift we were given that's the definition of freedom, is that we're still here to tell our stories and get to, when the rabbis were studying or telling the story all night, the ultimate gift is they then had the ability, the freedom to say the Shema.
Fabulous. Absolutely.
Diane,
yeah, Joel.
people just love stories, and stories are how people connect to what's going on in the world around us. If you read the New York Times, most articles start with the story of a person who is affected by whatever that article is ultimately about. This young woman in West Virginia has this situation, and therefore, or this situation happens in Tennessee, and therefore we need gun control, not we need gun control because it keeps people safe. People react to and respond to the stories and the individual situations in a way that numbers and statistics and mechanical stuff we were talking about earlier just don't land.
In a rare interview, Salman Rushdie was willing to talk a little bit. This is after the horrific attack on him at Chautauqua, I don't know, 2 years ago or something. Anyway, he didn't give interviews. But in this interview, when he was asked why he doesn't give interviews very often, he said, my life is not the center of the story. My stories speak for themselves. I want my stories to be my legacy, not me to be the legacy. That's not important. The stories are important. His books were banned right off the bat in certain countries, obviously. But at this point in our country, since 2021, there has been an exponential rise in book banning. The number of authors, the quality of the books being banned, children's books, adult books, Nobel Prize, authors in literature, Pulitzer Prize. I mean, the number of books that are banned is, if you look at a chart, it's just hugely on the rise. That means people's stories are being muzzled. The ability to tell your story is a defiant act of freedom. If you cannot tell your story, you're reduced, you're diminished, you're excluded. So there have been whole populations in our country and other countries whose stories never make it to the surface for anybody else to hear them or read them, which recently have come to the surface and now recently are being pushed out of libraries and schools. And teachers are nervous and librarians are nervous. So I think that the idea of telling your story as an act of freedom, and that now that you've told your story, now you can go worship the religion of your ancestors. This is a huge, huge piece of it. I want to, Anita, I'm sorry, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I
Go
just
ahead.
want to make this to me is the central story of Judaism. This ex-Catholic little girl was celebrating Seder's when I was 7, the only kid around the table. And I was so scared about reading in public. I would count the number of people, count the number of paragraphs, and I wanted to do it right, in spite of some of the words were strange. But many years later, I chose Judaism. And I think when you do a Seder, there is a lot of power and majesty and reverence around that table. And the story is so fabulous. It resonates with everybody. I wonder oftentimes how many years the impact of celebrating a Seder from age 7 basically on had in my choosing Judaism. My only comment.
So
Thank
interesting.
you.
You know, I'll share with you that our daughter-in-law is in the process of conversion, and it's really been a joyful process. This is the family in Hong Kong. But the real beginning of it, I think, was the first Seder she ever went to. This is before Josh and Emma got married. And Josh brought her to our friends, the Cates' Seder, which we're talking Boston. We're talking a very intellectual. This is a no kidding Seder. These are some really powerful people who have read a lot and thought a lot and taught a lot. And she's coming to this Seder and she listens and listens and listens. And then finally she tastes the matzo ball soup. And she says, "Oh, this is the best thing I have ever had." And everyone around the table said, "Okay, fine, you're Jewish." And now it's probably been 15, 16 years. She's going through formal conversion. I want to conclude by sharing something that is a little off task. Yes, PEN is a huge organization that PEN is a huge organization that fights for the freedom to write and speak, whomever you are, PEN America. I was at the Art Museum yesterday. They have an exhibit on medieval alabaster by a sculptor named Schneider. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Alabaster, apparently, and I had no particular interest in alabaster, but it's there. I want to go see. Alabaster apparently is a gypsum that is infused with some water. It's relatively soft. It's relatively fragile, and the pieces that are carved out of that are excavated out of the quarries that it's in are not large pieces. So alabaster tends not to be huge, huge figurines. In addition to which, because it's porous, we don't create sculptures with alabaster and set them outside for display. They're always interior displays. Aside from being absolutely captivated by the stunning craftsmanship and skill exhibited, I was reading a passage under one of them that I thought, oh my gosh, this is exactly what we have been talking about in our class, and I want to bring it to you. The sculpture was a Pietà, so that is Mary holding Jesus on her lap after he comes down from the cross. And there's many, many versions of this. This idea really caught hold, especially in medieval Europe. Maybe you've seen some of them. Hopefully you've seen some of them. And they're not Jewish, obviously, but they evoke such pathos. And here's what the person who wrote the little script underneath this exhibit said. She wrote actually, this scene, a Pietà, does not appear in the Gospels, but many medieval writers described it, sometimes based on mystical visions, inviting, and this is the part, inviting believers to become personally and imaginatively involved in the suffering of Jesus and his mother. To become personally and imaginatively involved. That was our first lesson. That's exactly what Dina Weiss was helping us do. And she was using Jewish texts and a 20th century Jew, his work, to help us see the value of being personally and imaginatively involved. And here I read those very words about a different religion, a different piece, a piece of art that captured the imagination of many, many artists. So we really are onto something universal when we talk about storytelling. And my hope is that as you enjoy your Seder, that the story comes out in ways that are fresh and meaningful and inspirational for the people who are there and for you, whether you're a listener or a teller. Joel?
Just wanted to say Chag Sameach and thank you to you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. So I wish everyone a Chag Kasher V'Sameach, a very wonderful Pesach. And don't forget that if you put a lot of butter on your matzah, it begins to counteract the impact of the matzah, or you can eat stewed fruit. Just want to say, okay, we're all of a certain age, and this is important to us. All right. Be well, everyone. Thank you so much.
Hi, Edith.